delighted to be here, and I'm hugely grateful for Sue for making that inextricable link between health and well-being of individuals and the buildings that they are occupying for the majority of their lives. As Deborah said, yes, I've been fortunate enough to work in lots of different fields. My introduction actually around health and well-being was back in 2005, working with the forest products sector, who were very interested in the impacts of wood in interiors and its impact on people and occupants in buildings and natural materials. And we're going to have a look at some of those aspects later when we look at the overall Biophilic office project, which is one of our fantastic programs at the moment. Before we do that, we're just going to have a quick look around indoor environment quality, why that's important, what are the sort of factors that cause or typically lead to poor indoor environment quality, and just remember that £1.4 billion that Sue mentioned, that cost to the NHS of poor housing. Extraordinary. How good IEQ can be achieved, and then I'm going to take you through three different areas of BRE activity. This idea around measurement and validation, of understanding occupants, which is fundamental, and of research. So if we had a conversation over coffee or now in an open discussion about what defined a great indoor environment, we would probably agree on lots of the qualities. They're pretty fundamental around buildings. It's what you can see out the window. It's how the place is lit, both naturally and artificially. It's what colours are present. It's about thermal comfort, ventilation, design, air quality, the acoustic environment. But it's also about the people. It's about how we behave in those environments and how we utilise that space against the functions that we're trying to achieve within those spaces. The bit that kind of is the complexity here, and Sue sort of touched on it as well, is that actually we're all different. So we will all have different versions of our own personal thermal comfort and our personal indoor environment. So that does add some complexity to the story. So broadly, IEQ, it's about the quality of that building or its space, the environment, and its impact on health and well-being of the occupants. We're spending typically 90% of our lives inside buildings. Those actually that were listed again, thankfully by the other speakers, those more vulnerable individuals in our society are probably spending 100% of their lives in indoor environments. So it's hardly surprising that that environment has a pretty critical impact on our health and well-being. Obviously, poor indoor environments and conversely, a good indoor environment can impact on our comfort, health and well-being. If we're in a work or a business environment, it can be around our performance and our productivity at work. In an educational environment, our ability to learn and to teach. In medical care environments and care environments, it's about healing and recuperation. And of course, the buildings themselves can be poorly impacted, as we've all seen through interior, if moisture gets into buildings and the ramifications for that, both in terms of the indoor environment and the longevity of that structure. And all that stuff adds up and impacts on the bottom line, whether it's the bottom line of the NHS or it's the bottom line of that particular building owner and operator. And it's hard to ignore the fundamental studies that are coming out that are showcasing, this is just last month, January, so the inside story around the health effects of indoor air quality on children and young people. A joint study through the Royal College of Physicians and the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. They have conducted a systematic review of the science around indoor pollution and had conversations and interviews with children, building operators, young people and families. So again, it's this real, we've got a very, very solid foundations of evidence building around the impacts of indoor environment, in this case, indoor air quality specifically, around health and well-being of our children and how they progress through our society. And I suppose when we think about indoor environment quality, I have stolen this slide from my colleague, Dr. Andy Dangle, who works in our BRE environment group. He talks about a spectrum of effects on occupants, and I think that's a really important thing to think of. We're not talking about, thankfully, everybody being at that top corner where it's about morbidity or mortality. Often it's more down at this level, and they sort of represent proportionally IEQ having that potential impact on building occupants. So those deleterious effects are ranging in severity. Some might be acute, some might be chronic. Some, as I was discussing with Raman around carbon monoxide, it might be a slow thing that gradually builds up and impacts on people later in life. So those chronic effects might be cumulative. So poor IEQ, contributing factors, not going to go through this in too much detail, just be very mindful around the whole design and planning issues of where buildings are and how they're occupied. Obviously how the buildings are managed internally in those environments through their HVAC systems is pretty critical. What products we utilise and the furnishings and fittings and how they're cleaned and maintained is fundamental to it, as is the lighting strategy, a really important part of indoor environment quality, and the building acoustics. And then overlaying all that is occupant behaviour. So it's understanding how people are using that space. As I mentioned earlier on, we're all different. We will all kind of intuitively use spaces slightly differently, actually, and require different conditions for them. Another thing to really bear in mind, and particularly, it's right in your face when you're walking down Euston Road in the morning, is this interaction between the outdoor and the indoor interfaces. So indoor environment is not just an isolated sort of box of conditions, it's interacting with that outdoor environment, with the traffic, or if you're lucky enough, the greener environment surrounding your building. And those outdoor environments might be around the air quality, the pollution, the noise, the lighting, chemical pollutants, and the weather impacts. And those indoor environment pollution conditions are responding to that around the air quality, ventilation, the lighting that's required in that space, the design, and the acoustics that might be necessary to mitigate some of those external interfaces and interactions. And then a final sort of remember is to think about perhaps unintended consequences. So our drive around energy efficiency, which has been a sort of parallel stream around carbon reduction and energy efficiency in buildings. Okay, airtight buildings without efficacious ventilation might actually have some consequences around indoor air quality, excessive heat build-up, inability to lose it, and also those conditions around dampness and mould that might occur within buildings. In addition, there may be particular contractual processes that impact, so that might be around the timing of heating and how it's supplied. There's this really tricky factor around balance of control. In office buildings, of course, building management systems know how to operate that building efficiently, but actually as a user and as a different person and our personal comfort levels, we might want a little bit more user control around it. So there's a very tight balance between the building operator and the building occupant. And then, of course, the unintended consequences are, well, what's happening around us? The effects of new buildings being built next to us, developments and processes nearby. They could be temporary. You could be lucky enough to have one of the new Crossrail stations being built outside your office window, for instance, for the next 3 or 4 years. So those things need to all be mapped in. And widely, the things to consider for achieving good IEQ, obviously consideration of location, orientation, nearby buildings, so following on from that point we were just looking at. Choice and specification of materials, so that interior fit out is critical. Strategies for HVAC, lighting, the acoustics and other key building systems. The fit out and design, so that design for the function and for the tasks that need to be completed within that building. All office tasks are not the same, so all office interiors should not be the same. And a really important element of that is to think about, well, monitoring of those internal conditions and to be gathering feedback from occupants as well. So getting a deeper understanding around the needs, behaviour, habits and interactions of those occupants within your built space. Again, to address that balance, you need to think about the level of building management and control that's going to be implemented in that building against, well, what are we going to give to our users in terms of our occupant level controls? And that could be, a sort of good example of that would be the simplicity of that occupant being able to go and move and work somewhere else because it's warmer or colder or the lighting's better for that particular task. And then, of course, it's aspects around maintenance and cleaning. They have natural impacts in terms of the indoor environment quality. So, bearing in mind that sort of landscape, I just wanted to run through 3 different areas of work that are relevant to this space, and some of those particularly supported by the BRE Trust. So we're going to look first at measurement and validation, and then understanding occupants, and then finally at research. So rather fantastically, under measurement and validation, for those that have not been to the BRE Group HQ in Watford, this is some of the images from inside the buildings you're often not allowed in. So this shows that our environment group in Fire Building and Technology Group, when they build mock-ups of actual buildings, to understand how they are performing. This here particularly is looking at trader desks in the financial sector. The two on the right are a mock-up of the part of the gallery structures that we use within the Abu Dhabi Louvre Museum. So full-scale mock-up is a surefire way of measuring and validating what we're doing. More often than not, though, the teams are more interested in, or more busy looking at particular products and system testing and assurance and proof of concept. So that's utilising chambers, test environments and mock-ups. And there's a particularly interesting theme around the proliferation around indoor environment quality monitoring and sensors. And, you know, you can zip off to Amazon and pay 50 quid or even less, actually, to get yourself an indoor environment quality monitor. But what's actually that telling you? And would all those devices tell you the same thing? Probably not. So very interested in looking at how specialist monitors, commercial, but also those consumer ones that are starting to pop up, can be utilised to improve indoor environment quality awareness, but also reaction to that. Sort of stepping up the level a little bit here, we're in a 30 metre cubed indoor air quality chamber here, and this just shows you some work that was going on looking at the impact of interior green walls on air quality. So in this environment, the research teams can dose the air with particular pollutants that might be present in typical indoor air quality, or indeed external air quality that might come into a building, and look at the efficiency of the plants and the substrates at removing those pollutants from the atmosphere. Some of that learning has been published in full scientific journals, so that's helping gain a deeper understanding through the Indoor Environment Journal in this case, of the impacts of those types of systems within buildings. They have some great opportunities to offer in other aspects. They make buildings look amazing, for instance, but we also want to learn about their technical capability at removing air pollutants. The next step up is our 40 metre cube indoor environment quality chamber. So this environment, as you can see, can be set up as a space within a building, a meeting room or an office particular, and can be occupied for full-scale indoor environment quality studies. So the ability to plug and play with furnishings and fit-outs, whatever you wish to be comparing. We also have a setup that has a twin office system, so we are able to compare a conventional fit-out within a system, or a lighting system, for instance, with an innovation, and to look and understand the impacts of that innovation on people. So this is the really critical next step. We've moved with getting people involved in the environment now and understanding their response to those different changes in the environment. And that segues nicely onto this next stage, which is really critical to this whole theme, is about understanding occupants. And I think too often in the world of the built environment, we forget who we're building buildings for or who we are refurbishing them for, and it's for people and occupants that are trying to do very specific tasks. So what I'd like to speak about here is a particular document and publication, and actually, Tom, could you pick up that copy and just wave it around so you can get your hard copy version next door in the this innovation hub, but really about creating positive workspaces. So designing workspaces that have positive impacts on health and well-being. So not just mitigating the bad stuff, having positive impacts. It's not easy, but how do we know if we're getting it right? And key to unlocking that information is about occupant information, about pre- and post-occupancy evaluation, which measures the performance throughout that building's life cycle. So right from preparation and brief through design, handover, and of course, critically, in-use function as well. So there it is, that's the report. We have been collaborating through the BRE Trust with Interface and Oliver Heath Design to really start making pre- and post-occupancy evaluation more accessible, so more people can start to get involved in it and start to explore how to assess their own particular buildings and understand how they are performing for those particular occupants and their particular tasks they're trying to conduct. So basically the guide covers, it's a very good explanation of what those occupancy evaluation studies do, what are the benefits, what does the process look like, and how to get started. And it's got quite a lot of case study examples in there, some of which you may or may not see parallels with your own particular buildings. So a really useful document, available probably only today in hard copy, but always on download from BRE and Interface websites. And I think the QR code also works on the posters as well, out in the innovation zone. Right, so the final sort of topic, so we're sort of ramping up a bit here. We've been about testing products, getting people involved, understanding how people are behaving in whole buildings. And core to BRE is our research aspects, and of course generating new evidence to enable things to happen. And I'm going to talk specifically about the Biophilic office. So this particular project is all about growing and deepening that evidence base for the health, well-being, and in this case, because it's an office, the productivity impacts of a restorative office environment. So this is a positive office environment being delivered by Biophilic design. So those that may not be familiar, so whether it's the mighty HQ here in London or whether it's the Google spheres, Biophilic design is a major threading trend through the health and well-being agenda in the commercial office environment. Effectively, it's tapping into biophilia, which is our inherent connection to nature. Remember, we're spending 90% of our lives in buildings, disconnected from nature, yet we are part of nature. This was popularised in 1984 through Edward O. Wilson's book, Biophilia. Quite a good read and not too lengthy. I'd recommend that to you. The translation of that into biophilic design is how we bring natural or natural analogues into our built environments through our materials, our lighting, our acoustics, and our indoor air quality and our ventilation. And you can see examples of that being done, which is fantastic. Bit of a reality check though. Most offices in Britain look like this. So what can we do in a biophilic design context that will help these guys here? And I think hopefully by the end of this little piece you'll understand there are some qualities there that can be adopted and changed. And I pick up that word that Deborah used at the beginning about making things accessible. So we're here to provide the evidence to enable people to do things better, to improve indoor environment quality in their office buildings, but we want it to be accessible so everybody can take their first steps and make changes. And, you know, there's whole bunches of evidence about why that's important to do. This is probably the most seminal bit, the World Green Building Council report from 2014 on health, well-being and productivity in offices. Lots of evidence and data around the impacts of cooler environments, warmer environments, people that sit near windows and that don't, on the impact of individuals and thus the better business outcome, the productivity within that office environment. The most striking one is the 66% drop in performance when exposed to distracting noise. Anyone that works in an open plan office will know what distracting noise is. We have ears, we can't switch them off like we can when we close our eyes. We cannot help but listen into other people's conversations. Don't worry, you're not the only one, and particularly when names are involved. So that idea of distracting speech being a fundamental aspect of impact on performance is really very interesting, and certainly can be tackled through biophilic design and other acoustic measures. So at the core of the project, we are looking at practical interventions, those practical, accessible interventions. Can they be quantified as part of the decision-making process? So that really is about, can we turn that into a return on investment? If we spend more on this, can we get back better outcomes for our business? What are those better business outcomes? I kind of use that phrase a bit more than productivity because productivity is really tricky to measure in most business environments, other than if you're a factory making one single item. And then it's about how we provide that practical guidance to engage with the refurbishment contractors, real estate, etc., to enable more people to do it. This is a glimpse at the fantastic project team that are supplying the resources and the know-how within this program and project. And we've got a couple of them here today. We've got Sunita from AkzoNobel. Sunita, where are you? She's up there if you want to talk about AkzoNobel and all the work they've done on colour and in interiors and health and well-being. We've got Jim from Voldman Lighting. Is Jim here? If he's not, he's certainly got outside in the stand, they've got some of their amazing biodynamic lighting systems that they're working on. So again, do go and have a look at that. So a whole range of technologies and processes being built into that building. Our study office and our control office are both based at our Garston site. They're broadly similar building typologies and occupations. They're pretty unimpressive buildings, but again, very representative of the office stock across the UK and wider Europe, and providing that opportunity for us. The critical thing here is the longitudinal nature of this study. So it's a very long-term piece of work. We keep repeating assessments and measures to build that data. Certainly, I feel slightly more optimistic and positive in the summer months of the year rather than the winter. You know, we have to pick up seasonality. We have to do longitudinal studies to gain that robust evidence. We've done very deep materials and services inventory on the building. We're focusing very intensely on indoor air quality, so temperature, humidity, CO2, periodic monitoring around ventilation and VOC, so volatile organic compounds, and that's not just the total. So we're looking at individual volatile organic compounds, which means we can then attribute them to their source within that indoor environment. The acoustic environment, like many things, it's modelled as part of the environment, but it's also being characterised by walk-through surveys and direct noise monitoring within the buildings, both in terms of the office environment and also that background exterior noise, if you will. Similarly, the lighting environment is both modelled for daylight, the distribution across the office space and the annual profiles that would come with that within those particular buildings, the daylight illuminance at eye level. And it's also being monitored directly as well alongside the existing artificial light systems. The image down here is a little wearable device, so we can actually monitor the occupant's total exposure to lighting and through to natural lighting, because one of the critical things that hangs all this together, and remembering we build buildings because people need to be in them, is around the occupant monitoring itself. And this is sort of three-pronged, if you will. So the psychological aspects of it relate to the questionnaires and the tools and cognitive tasks that we're conducting. So there's very deep quarterly surveys, and there are monthly surveys as well that occupants are completing. There are physiological aspects through wearable technology, so activity, sleep pattern, etc., and biomarkers, so using stress hormone analogues to understand how, not necessarily whether people are stressed, but more how people are coping with stress when they're asked to do some of the cognitive tasks, which are very focused and timed activities. And then the final one is around the sort of productivity measures, the better business outcomes, which is all that other information which provides, in a way, that return on investment for the changes around the economic aspects associated with doing something differently, in this case, the refurbishment of an office building, around absenteeism, around outcome, around service level agreement datas, around complaints, around other activities. So very, very briefly, in a nutshell, and we'll be launching the prefurbishment report imminently, which will contain a good summary of where we've got to so far, which is well over a year's worth of data of how these buildings function and perform. So if we looked at indoor air quality, you know, the TVOC content is well below thresholds, temperature and humidity is mostly within acceptable ranges, and not really surprisingly, the CO2 builds up during the day, declines overnight. So nothing particularly alarming there, and particularly when you think about individuals have the ability to self-ventilate, they can open their own windows if they feel it's needed. Acoustic environment, again, nothing particularly striking has come from that. Higher noise levels generally linked to office activities, and unoccupied levels generally within recommended ranges. We don't have a lot of external noise impacting on that environment. Lighting is a bit patchy, and we have Cosmin, our lighting expert here, who's been supporting the research and the measurement within that project. Generally below CIBSE recommended standards and the EN standards that align with that, although they are very well daylit buildings, which of course can bring other issues around glare and so on. So lighting's a little bit iffy, but the real sort of telling point for me is that if we just sort of measured individual things, we might not think too much of the building. If we start to ask people about it, you get an awful lot of data back about how poor that building is operating for individuals. 73% rated temperature as unstable. So this is not about the thresholds that it's operating within, which is what we're traditionally looking at. It's about how quickly it's changing. Huge impact on people. So really, really underpinning the importance of getting occupant data back from your projects, your buildings, your offices. So this is where we are in our timeline. We're at a very exciting part of the project where we've concluded our refurbishment stage. We're moving into that little central refurbishment stage, which I'll mention in a moment. And that will be followed again by another long period of post-refurbishment where the people come back into the offices and we reiterate the measurements that we've been collecting so far. So phase 2 refurbishment, anyone who's interested, we're looking to bring more people into this program. We've started some conversations already beyond the partnership we already have. The principles are that we're looking at 3 different design level interventions based around biophilic design. I won't go into the detail of them now, but essentially that first one is really thinking about accessible things that most building owners and occupiers could take on board and could adopt some of those issues, right the way up to the top end, which is really around innovation and design, where more technology is coming in to provide some of those solutions. We're supported by some amazing dissemination partners which are helping us to outreach, but will also help us when we have that evidence about how we need to get it into the right hands of the people to take action. So whether that's the BCO or CIBSE or the architects or the chartered surveyors. And then finally, because we can't have, the 15,000 or so visitors we get to our site each year tramping through that office, that's not really practical. Whilst we'll have a virtual impression of that office, we also want to convert part of one of our buildings, our innovation park, to a biophilic office demonstrator. And this is the progress and process that's happening now around designing a smaller space, because fundamentally biophilic design, indoor environment quality, lighting, all these things, when they come together, it's about experiential. You know, you need to be in it to feel it and to see and to understand the benefits of those attributes. So the Biophilic Office Demonstrator is something that's in process at the moment. And just to summarise, because I'm very conscious it's lunchtime, the IQ, as Sue said, is inextricably linked to our health and well-being. We spend all our times in buildings. This is not a surprise. What is a surprise is that we still do not fully understand this, and it is vital for us to understand both personally but also as organisations through measures and the impacts that might come from that. Occupants are key to that, about unlocking that data and information, and also the opportunity for positive change. You know, that's the real beauty of this, is that options for changes and improvements flow from it. We're busy generating more evidence so more people can get on this train and start to take action. And we're also doing a lot more work around products, solutions and sensors to provide the compelling data that will help foster the innovation but also underpin its delivery. And I would urge you to tap into this increasing wealth, as I showed you earlier, that first report just issued in January about the increasing wealth of very deep forensic studies that have been conducted around this and its overall impacts. And just finally, it's not a suggestion that this will transition into this anytime in the future, but the idea is that some of this, which might be very aspirational, can certainly be delivered in the majority of offices across the UK. And part of that will mobilise that is about that return on investment and highlighting the impact of not doing that, quite frankly, and the poor quality of indoor environment that is present. So, thank you very much.